People think that the British Empire ended after the Second World War when it gave up its colonies and gave them independence. But is that really the case? Maybe the British Empire is still running the show behind the shadows and owns large parts of the world through the crown. That's what we're going to be talking about in this video. Hey, Matt, thank you so much for making yourself available. Everybody, please subscribe, comment, like, wave to Matt, right? And he may wave back. Do that in the comments below. It helps me beat the algorithm and the channel grow. And I'll have the links where you can find Matt, Canadian Patriots, and his ex, and all sorts of other interesting places. And thank you again for sharing your incredible knowledge about
Oh,
what's going on behind the curtain, right?
hey, Rich, it's always a pleasure. I love chatting with you. Your questions are great. Your audience is fantastic. So this is a pleasure and a joy for me to just come on and just talk about big ideas that I think people really do need to internalize as the storm is going to get worse. It is already pretty bad. It's not going to get easier. It's not going to get more calm in the near term future. So we need to have our wits about us and a good knowledge of what got us here, what kind of bad and toxic ideas got us here, and inversely what kind of good ideas have historically saved humanity at periods of similar kinds of crises. So I love chatting with you for that solution orientation that you have.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And you and I recorded a video a few weeks ago. You've been on a few times, and you'll be on a few times more, provided we both behave ourselves.
Mm.
And you sent me an article from your blog, from your Substack. And one of the things that struck me is that Canada, or the Crown, owns 89% of Canada. Now, Canada's really, really, really big.
Mm.
10% of Canada is a hell of a lot. 89% owned through the crown. So that got me thinking about how much does the crown own of India and South Africa and Kenya and
Yeah.
Pakistan and New Zealand and Australia and other former colonies, and then what is the crown and who's benefiting and how come we don't know about this? Because all this sort of stuff that we're talking about is what the mainstream media won't do. There's very little proper journalism. I don't think there's any journalism in the mainstream media anymore, really. Okay,
No, yeah.
let's start with what is the crown?
Yeah, I think the crown, that's a good place to start, just to define it, because the thing we've been told was the British Empire was never really what the British Empire was. We were lied to. It
Oh,
wasn't just, people were told it's the guys in the funny hats and red suits going around projecting power militarily. And I gotta say, when you really look at the dynamics shaping what goes on behind the scenes and what actually shapes causally global processes for good or for bad, you tend to find that the military aspect is usually not, it's not even close to being the most important mechanism of what allows for a society to project its real power. The real power is located in its political intelligence, its control over the culture, its control over banking and finance are, I would say, all more important than the military aspect, which has its role, it has its place, but it's not as influential or as causal as we are led to believe. So, number one, when you look at the British Empire's influence as the empire in which the sun never set, which was a title it held for many centuries, um, this had much more to do with the city of London as a nexus of controlling global finance. It had also a British East India Company as far as utilizing the surface appearance of capitalism under the British East India Company that had earlier merged with the Dutch East India Company after they had clashed for a few decades. There was basically an agreement to merge and use that as the basis of expanding economic influence, which would subdue and weaken and ultimately destroy the ability, the sovereignty of target nations from standing on their own 2 feet. India, China, just being two of many examples. Many nations of the Caribbean also suffered similar fates that were reduced to becoming cash cropping sugar cane plantation colonies. But the whole thing was a very centralized system of global financial control and enslavement to keep nations from having full spectrum economies. In that, what I mean is keep them from developing industries and manufacturing such that everybody was forced to simply export one controlled item dominantly, like India was allowed to export opium as its one permitted dominant export. China was allowed to export tea and silk, but they weren't allowed to actually develop or have the type of manufacturing capabilities that they had enjoyed before the British Empire got in and destroyed their economies and brought them into a global free trade mechanism. So all of that to say, how that relates to the crown as an institution is very important, because the question is this happening without or in a completely detached way or from a detached mechanism as the institution of the crown, or is this part of the same mechanism as an integrated whole? The authority through which the British Empire has exerted its influence throughout its first its colonies, then the Commonwealth as a whole, which represents well over 50 countries of the world that still have that are part of the British Commonwealth. There is something called the crown. The crown is different from the person who sits there at any given moment, who might come and go. But the institution of the crown is known as the fount of all honors. It's the agency through which the honors system flows, the different orders flow, whether it's the chivalric orders of St. George and St. Michael that's granted to various minions of the crown that do special service for the agency of empire. Like, for example, George Bush was knighted and by the Queen in 92 and made or 94 and made a Knight of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, as was Sir Henry Kissinger, as were many others, or the Knight of the Order of Bath, or the Order of the Garter. So you have on the one hand that, but you also have certain things like the very institution itself of the crown agents. So you have things that have been around since the 18th century. I think officially in 1835, the Crown Agents Limited was set up as an emanation of the crown, as something which controlled the various branches of the civil service in different parts of the global colonies. And this is something which even exists to this very day, controlling much of the healthcare infrastructure of Ukraine, the energy infrastructure, many of the governments of
hold on. The crown controls the
Crown Agents.
interest of
Crown Agents
Ukraine?
Limited. Yeah. Crown Agents Limited.
What is the Crown Agents Limited as
Yeah.
part of the crown, part of this fount of honor,
hmm
like derived from that, owns the Ukrainian health service?
Yes. Since 2016, it was officially assigned to run and manage the Ukrainian health service, the distribution of jabs under COVID, blah, blah, blah. It also runs and manages the infrastructure, much of the health infrastructure of Zimbabwe, of Sierra Leone, of Libya, of Nepal, of South Sudan, number of other countries too. And it's one of those things that have been around again for a very long time. It's gone through a few different rebrandings over the years. It has a financial services arm as well, which still exists under a slightly different London-based management that has a lot of interest in private equity and investment capital in Africa. So this is one aspect of it. Then you have, yeah, I know, and people can Google this. There's also something I'll just show here as a quick image from a recently produced article that I actually shared with you. The audience may not know this, but this is from a recent article that I had done. Actually, I published this in 2023 called Global Britain and King Charles' Great Reset. And in it, I showcased a simple picture here. And this is a little section on crown agents set up in 1833 with some details and statistics. And this is a picture of what people might recognize today as far as the Commonwealth of Nations today, representing about 21% of the surface area on the Earth. Obviously, Australia, a big chunk of the South African area. Canada is a part of that. So 21% of the surface area of the Earth, the Falkland Islands as well, just off the coast of Argentina, is still under British control. And one can compare that with the British Empire at its maximum size, representing about 22.5% of the world's surface area in the 1920s, before the Commonwealth or the Empire gave liberty to the Commonwealth and stopped becoming an empire and simply had the U.S. take over and the empire became a little country just caring about its own backyard. So that's very similar, strikingly similar maps that we see in both cases. Now, much of the infrastructure that was built up over centuries never fully disappeared, whether it's in India and in Pakistan, where the British made sure to partition those countries in a very specific way to prevent a genuine independence movement from happening after or during even World War II. That was the orientation, right? Originally, there was going to be a genuine independence movement of Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims together, united in their common aspiration for freedom from the British Empire and its radical genocidal abuses that resulted in over 23 mass genocides, famines that were controlled from the top.
Do you want to stop sharing?
Oh, yes, of course. That's a good idea. So that was supposed to happen. But of course, Lord Mountbatten, who was then in charge of the strategy of simply delaying that the granting of independence, was done in order to specifically take that extra year in order to set the stage for basically a divide to conquer program of getting the Hindus and the Sikhs, and especially the Hindus and Muslims, to despise each other and to rapidly fight for the next coming generations under the influence of intelligence agencies that remained under the guiding hand of British grand strategy. Same thing happened for many of the things like, well, I mean, if you think that the British just gave up on China, never the case. You know, even Hong Kong was only granted so-called back to mainland China in 1997. And even now, Hong Kong, the HSBC Bank, still controls 1/3 of the money supply printing of the Hong Kong money, even now, despite the fact that efforts to overthrow the Chinese mainland government's influence over the semi-autonomous province of Hong Kong was thwarted. Despite that, British influence is still quite high, even in the Hong Kong judiciary. These are major drug banks too. HSBC, as we'll discover in our next interview, it plays a big role in global narcotics and the maintenance of global organized crime syndicates, and has since it was founded in 1865 in the wake of the First Opium War. That's still an influence, right? The control also of Macau by Portugal, that had an oligarchy which works very closely with the British oligarchy in managing world systems, also was only given back to China in 1999 and still remains a global banking and narcotics capital even now. So you have this whole global system in place, and the Crown. The question is, how does this interface? I already mentioned the Crown Agents Limited as one aspect of it. Well, you also have, you know, you mentioned the property owned by the Crown. Not only is it 89% of the Canadian territory, but 6.6 billion acres on the globe, which includes vast territories in Australia and New Zealand, in the Falklands, Northern Ireland, the UK itself, obviously, is under Crown. These are Crown lands. You have the Crown Estates, which is another entity which manages some. It's among the largest property groups of the world. The Crown Estate. It's again like limited. It controls some of the biggest retail parks in England and the Commonwealth more broadly, shopping centers, agricultural lands, castles, estates, galore, wind farms. It controls near the entire seabed of England is under the ownership of Crown Estates, and 25% of all annual revenues from the Crown Estates goes to the Crown, the monarch itself, to maintain the costs of, I guess, just being a giant welfare recipient.
Well, he is a pensioner, right? We want to take care of our pensioners.
Of course. Yeah. It is. Pensioners require a lot of servants.
That's right. Yeah.
So, you know, you have these things. On the other hand, too, you have certain powers that often are not necessarily used, but are there for a reason, to be used. And here I'm referring to, and I go through this in the essay, the prerogative powers. And this became revealed in 2003. I think a London Guardian expose made a reveal of something that people thought was a myth up until that moment. And the prerogative powers of the Crown give vast supranational, super jurisdictional authority of whoever is sitting in that position to declare war, to control domestic affairs, to appoint and dismiss ministers, to regulate the civil service, I mentioned earlier, commissioning honors, make treaties with other governments. You could recognize foreign states. And that's something, again, which even in 2009 in the British Parliament, there was a bill put forth to limit the prerogative powers, and a Privy Council Act was enforced to block that bill basically with the logic that under any given time of crisis, we will need to use these powers by the crown to do things. It's kind of like the executive, I guess you could think of what was allowed under the Patriot Acts since 9/11 in the United States. It gives essentially executive rule by executive decree. If everything is always an emergency, you don't need to go through the typical channels of government in order to make law. You can simply pass, for good or for bad, executive orders, which is the way the US has been managed for 25 years now, since 9/11. And that's sort of the idea behind the prerogative powers. Obviously, as well, the governor generals, which express the power of the crown in various colonies, like in Canada, the governor general is the official head of state. You and I talked about this in a recent interview. Everything that becomes law, if it will become law, it has to not only be a bill that's passed in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, or otherwise known as the Commons for the commoners. I think it's a very arrogant label on the House of Commons for the commoners. But not only does the bill have to be passed in both of those places, but then it has to be given assent, royal assent. So the power to reject it, though it rarely needs to ever happen, is there also within the governor general, who has to sign off, or in the provinces, a lieutenant governor that represents the legal hand of the crown has to sign off and give royal assent to provincial legislation as well, or can veto it if they so choose, but it rarely is needed. The other thing, if there is let's say a vote of no confidence, all of a sudden, it doesn't mean that you're going, typically that means in a parliamentary system under Commonwealth that you will force an election if there's a minority government, right? And the opposition parties group up and say, we vote no confidence. Well, that typically forces an election, but it doesn't mean it has to. As we saw in the case of, I think it was 2009 in Canada, where all parties, at the time, Stephen Harper, who was the minority prime minister of Canada, was begging the next day at the door of our governor general, along with Michael Ignatieff and the opposition parties, who were all begging the governor general to authorize their desires. And the governor general came out and, basically said, okay, I authorize the vote, an election, which did happen, and Harper did win a second time. So that does occur. And I'll say one more thing before you throw in because it's a very well-oiled machine. Most of the time, it's not needed that the governor general actually use the power of the prerogative to get a policy across. But there are occasions where that is used. And the one case that is very dramatic is in the 1975 case of the Australian prime minister, which you've probably heard of, Gough Whitlam.
Yeah.
And he's an individual who was a man of the people. He had a vision for liberating Australia from the structures of the Five Eyes, of the GCHQ, NSA control over Australian security and intelligence services. And he had a plan to basically kick out those foreign agencies. He had a program to nationalize a lot of those privatized agencies and basically drive an industrial policy for Australia to become economically self-sufficient. He had a very, very beautiful program in place. But the second that he made a move on the Five Eyes and made a move to make it Australia independence, Philip Kerr, who was then the governor general, as your audience might know, was deployed to basically called him into the governor general's office and promptly fired him. That's right, fired him. So it is something which has been used at different times when there is somebody, a well-intended subject of the colonies, who gets out of hand and starts following their own moral pathway. They are flushed by institutions tied to the crown per se. So yeah.
Okay. So it could happen conceivably in the UK that, for example, had Jeremy Corbyn become prime minister, that the monarch could have fired him.
It could have easily have happened. Yeah.
Okay.
The other thing too is that there are certain oaths that one must take if you are going to be a player in politics anywhere in the Commonwealth or the UK. And this is, of course, the oaths of secrecy that you are forced to take in Privy Council to become a Privy Councillor, because you're not allowed to become a prime minister or a member of the shadow government, the opposition parties, if you are not a Privy Councillor. Now, the Privy Council.
So what's a Privy Councillor, and how do Governor Generals get chosen?
Governor Generals typically get chosen. Well, we're not really privy. to the backdoor discussions and negotiations of how a governor general is necessarily vetted and selected and chosen. What I can say, though, is that when you look at especially the lieutenant governors of, I'll use Canada as an example, going back to the creation of the institution in 1867, which was when our British North America Act was established, enshrining a monarchy, a confederated monarchy of the Americas. The only one that's not a republic is here in Canada. Um, Nearly every single member, I would say every single member up until 2006 or so, and even now it's still mostly most of the lieutenant governors have always been Knights of the Order of Saint John of Jerusalem, otherwise known as the British branch of the Order of Malta, which was a name given. The Sovereign Order of Malta was a name given to the Order of Hospitallers, which was a crusader order that was established to oversee the bloodbath, the ritual murder of centuries of cultural warfare called the Crusades. And that was the first order set up to oversee that bloodbath as a Gnostic, secretive, initiatory order with an outward public face and an inner secretive, esoteric structure that was used to infiltrate and control many of the deep state apparatuses of the world over the ensuing 800 years. So the British version was created in the late 19th century because it's typically a Catholic order, but the British have an Anglican sort of aspect to it. So they created an Anglican version of the same thing with the same order, the Maltese cross being their still symbol. It's the same thing. And you had to be a lieutenant governor, you had to be initiated as a member of said order. And there's a book called Dope Incorporated published by Executive Intelligence Review back in 1978, which I have on my bookshelf. And I think everybody who wants to really know the anatomy of this thing should pick up, you can get it online for free, a copy of Dope Incorporated, any of the published editions which go through this. So the Privy Council interfaces directly with this shadow government structure of unelected agents that are enshrined in the constitutions of Australia, of Canada, of other parts of the Anglo-Saxon Commonwealth countries. And I think that when you look at both the Privy Council and the Privy Council office, they're two different things that interact. So the Privy Council is simply a body, I think maybe in Canada's case, 350 or so members who are alive today who are part of it. Conrad Black was a member for a long time. There's members of the public sector who play a role in like, for example, Charles Bronfman, one of the heads of the Bronfman mafia crime dynasty, and also equity, private equity system of control. The Edper for the Edgar Peter Bronfman dynasty are the two children of Charles Bronfman. That's one of the biggest private equity capital companies in the world that merged with another agency called Brascan in the late 90s to form Brookfield. Brookfield Asset Management is what Mark Carney ended up running for a number of years. And they're basically gobble machines. They're designed to just gobble and own up physical assets around the world. In this case, energy and infrastructure, much of it being in Latin America. But this was run by one of the top mafia, crime, drug, narcotics families of the world, who was, at the time, the patriarch, Charles Bronfman, was a privy councillor. Maurice Strong, the founder of Agenda 20, and the Green New Deal. He was also a privy councillor for many, many years until his death. So you have both people within the government as well as high value people. I think, like I mentioned, Conrad Black, but many other private sector, public, high value mercenaries for the empire are vetted. And once you're vetted, you have oaths of secrecy to keep all things secret that will be given in Privy Council. It's pretty much illegal to speak aloud outside of Privy Council things that are given to you. And people can Google and listen to Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney give their oaths of secrecy, their pledge of allegiance to be good servants to His Majesty King Charles and keep things secret as a good servant must and ought to. Those are available on YouTube for all to watch. It's disgusting. So generally speaking, I would say there's a self-organizing system that vets people so that they're already quite psychologically profiled and wound up as toys so that they're quite predictable and well behaved. But occasionally you get a Gough Whitlam, occasionally you'll get a John Diefenbaker who will step out of line, who has a moral conscience that's more powerful than the programming that was fed into them, and they would have to be occasionally flushed by certain maneuvers. Let's say, for example, what happened to John Diefenbaker, our short-lived prime minister, who was one of the few, I think, authentic human beings who occupied that position. He was flushed in 1963, a few months after John F. Kennedy was killed, and it had a lot to do with the fact that he tried to genuinely nationalize, and take control of, not even nationalize, but take control and use the Bank of Canada, which was a crown corporation that he understood to be different from what it was. He said that, well, if it's a crown corporation, it's owned by the people. He was wrong. But see, his naivete made him troublesome because he said, well, why don't we're going through a recession that's destroying our economy. Why don't we just use this Bank of Canada to emit productive credit for the development of our Arctic? And he had a whole strategy called the Arctic Vision to build advanced science cities and industrial corridors and roads to resources all throughout the Arctic. And it was a beautiful vision that won him a majority in the 1958 elections. But the problem was he was, number one, unaware that the British Empire exerted its influence through their Rhodes Scholarship Program and these various roundtable think tanks, which there were many in Canada, including within his own government. You had various Rhodes Scholars like Davy Fulton, his justice minister, who had a whole branch, a whole nexus of young Rhodes Scholar, Oxford-trained mercenaries who were devoted to maintaining Canada's control, or the Britain's control of Canada, and sabotaged him at every move, including the governor of the Bank of Canada, who was also a Rhodes Scholar, who played a key role in overseeing his downfall and destruction with the collusion of the media. So he didn't understand what he was operating within, and he ultimately was completely sabotaged every step of the way. He got nothing done that he intended to get done. And one of the things he says in his autobiography years later, reflecting on what was done to stop him, he says, and he still doesn't get it. He says, I don't understand why these agents within my own government sabotaged me at every step. I had the best advice that any prime minister could ever want, as the Queen herself gave me briefings once a week, and she was telling me everything. And even with that wise woman's advice, I was still misstepping and being sabotaged. And he never understood. He never understood that that's the reason why.
Or he didn't want to say.
Didn't want to say is possible, but he believed the way in reading his speeches after he got taken down, and he spent another decade as a member of parliament, is that he believed in the John Birch Society narrative that the conspiracy to destroy humanity, the satanic conspiracy, which he did believe was happening, and he did believe that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a member of this satanic conspiracy to undermine humanity and the Judeo-Christian order. He truly did believe that. And there was a lot of truth in what he believed, except that the way that the narrative under the Cold War was managed for those who saw it and were receptive to conspiracies, of especially the conservative Christian mindset, much like it is today, as was John Diefenbaker, is that they said, okay, we acknowledge all of these facts. However, the culprit, the satanic agents, is the Chinese and Chinese and Russian commies. It's a communist conspiracy to destroy you. And he didn't understand the British. He still loved the fact that the British had made him, that the Queen had made him a free man, so he didn't have to, pay for parking tickets, or he didn't have to really obey the laws if he didn't want to as a free man on the land, because that's part of the way the City of London was wired. Was in, you had the Magna Carta, it gave certain rights to break the law for those who are free men. And that meant, in the case of the Magna Carta of 1215, written by the Norman feudal barons, the robber barons, that's who was drafted. They basically said, okay, the free men are the people who own property, and human beings are part of the property. They're feudal human talking cows. We can do whatever we want. We don't have to abide by any rules or laws of the nation. We are the free men. However, that could then be used as a loophole in ensuing generations to get around certain legal, tricks, as we see today with the free man movement. John Diefenbaker took great pride in that idea. Also, the City of London was enshrined in the Magna Carta as having its ancient privileges to be above the laws of England per se. So and it says explicitly it will enjoy the city with its livery companies, you know, it will enjoy its supranational jurisdictions that are ancient. And certainly when you start going at it was already ancient in 1215. Well, yeah, it was, because the City of London is directly in a location. The city within a city, that square mile, is a center of the Isis cult, the ancient Isis temple, as its sister temple was located in Paris. Para-Isis is the name for Paris. And that was part of the ancient Roman Londinium, as part of the governing system of what allowed the mystery cults to shape uh, the geographical, the geoeconomic, the psychological and spiritual terrain of the world that they wish to influence under this high priesthood system of the ancient Roman Empire and even earlier Republican days when Brutus first came in and set up Londinium. So this is a very, very, there's a continuity, is what I guess I'm trying to say, of these high sorcerer types who use different symbols, different techniques to do the same thing over millennia. And the idea of banking, as John Maynard Keynes had made the point, as a leading Fabian and eugenicist, he understood economics to be a form of witchcraft, that you could use the power of numbers in order to create an illusion of the appearance of truth in order to destroy your enemies on behalf of, let's say, the British Empire, who could, again, you could play with statistics, and if you're smart enough and could process enough data and you're deceitful enough, you could do more damage and conquer more territory with the stroke of some pens working for the World Bank or the IMF or the City of London or the Bank of England than you could with, private mercenary armies. And that's something that has been known for a long time. So economics is really about, in that sense, there's an imperial economics, which is about control and exerting the influence of a master class over slaves, which the City of London has generally been oriented towards. And then there's a legitimate anti-feudal economics, which is about building real value and making money the servant of the people, the way John Diefenbaker or other Hamiltonians that he admired, like Lincoln or like Franklin Roosevelt, had understood the idea of credit as being something that must be tied to the building of things that make life better for the future and that infuse value into the money in circulation. It's not the supply and demand idea or the fact that people want it that gives it value, but it's what are you creating that's making you more free, more prosperous, more abundant than you were before you did the thing. And that's a totally different paradigm.
That is just incredible, absolutely incredible. And what I'm reminded of is something that I've said to you before when we've recorded. I just want to pull this little string, just find out about this little string, and like, oh my gosh, it's so long and it winds round so much. And the sense that I get from talking to you, listening to you, is that there are these. So you got the fount of honor. That actually, that's, I suppose, the institution, where it represents, if I use a metaphor like a cloak, that the monarch wears, whichever physical body comes along, whichever human body comes along, puts on this cloak, the fount of all honor. But it's that institution that has all these powers that it's able to bestow, and it kind of permeates outwards through governor generals, through privy councils,
Through crown institutions
crown
and crown
institutions,
corporations
crown
and
corporations.
yeah.
And then as it sort of fans out, you'll have people in corporations, private corporations, that are actually agents acting on behalf of the fount of honor.
Yes.
You might have somebody who's heading up an oil company, or some other corporation or whatever, as well as those within the security services, the intelligence services, and the military, and of
Mhm.
course parliament and civil service. And then that also extends out into the other countries, so they'll have connections with the ruling elite in India,
Yes.
in Canada and South Africa. And I've just posted a couple of videos about South Africa with a couple of South African journalists about what's going on in there and how the
Mm,
British are stirring things in South Africa and they're using it to extract the wealth like they're
yes.
doing in Sierra Leone. So it's just absolutely just
Well,
incredible,
and
insidious.
absolutely, yeah, and it's all interconnected. They seem different, but again, the offshore money, the money laundering centers, right? The tax havens, as the film The Spider's Web went through very well, a British film that went viral, glorious movie, and it really showcased the power of the tax havens, the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man, the other things that provide for trillions, upwards of $50 trillion of capital flight that is that is tied to literally nobody. So you have these, anonymous shell corporations that own shell corporations that extract wealth from Africa, from Latin American countries where you have often Western trained dictators and agents in their civil service in Kenya or in Nigeria or in Uganda or other places who are then reinstated after getting conditioned in Cambridge or Oxford or some other Western institution and then reinstated to do what they do, right? To simply just be what they are as servants of the empire that will give them a lot of personal wealth, that will involve them extracting a lot of that money from bribes and from other things that they literally just steal from graft from their countries. Ukraine is a recent example that's very clear. And then we'll hide it in offshore, British run Cayman Islands institutions that will then be perfectly opaque. And so that's another part of how the money is moved around. It's part of how the organized crime syndicates that are built up in various countries maintain themselves, financially speaking, is through entirely the support of the Wall Street banks and the offshore accounting systems. So yeah, it's a very, very, and then you have things like the remembrancer, right? So you have openly strange entities that have been around for centuries, where the City of London can have their official ambassador in Parliament who has the authorization as the remembrancer to see all acts of Parliament before they're even presented publicly. He can read them. He has the right to. He's sort of the representative between the City of London, the Crown, and the Parliament and the House of Lords, and he could see and do anything and basically threaten anything too, make suggestions. And you have things like the Black Spider memos, So we know that King Charles, who's recently redubbed himself the defender of the faiths. In England, it's a theocracy. It's not simply a monarchy. It's that the head of the England is also the head of the church. It's sort of a British pope, and that title of Defender of the Faith of Henry VIII was turned into Defender of the Faith plural by King Charles, who also dubs himself as the Eco Warrior King. So he's been proven to be an aggressive proponent of massive depopulation as the president of the World Wildlife Federation of England. His Black Spider memos that went public in 2013, the Black Spider memos that were even covered by the London Guardian and even the BBC, demonstrated this incontinent lobbying, which the person of the crown is supposed to be apolitical, but he was provably lobbying the members of parliament, the prime minister, to push vast ecological Green New Deal legislation. And it's been known that a quiet constitutional revolution is underway and has been planned for a very long time, manifested with the figure of today's King Charles, who is planning to use the current crisis in order to activate a more aggressive use of prerogative powers and simply wants to create a condition or is waiting for that condition to be unleashed of general chaos out of which a sufficient numbers of the population can be induced to start begging for some stability out of the chaos. And maybe that stability might call for the invocation of the princes and the monarch as active agents of control, as they once enjoyed during the days of the crusade of the feudal system, where most people knew their place as talking cows and maybe had the privilege of being hired mercenaries to be killed under forever wars for their slave masters. So that's kind of the thing today that I think King Charles has positioned himself to engage in.
Well, we've got a better version of it because we
Mm.
own nothing and eat cricket and we'll be really, really happy. And it's for our own
As
good,
long as they're
doing for us.
yeah, as long as they're chocolate dips and fondue for the crickets, then it's okay.
I don't want any crickets.
Or
Matt,
we could have our virtual reality steaks and just enjoy that if we don't
yes,
like the crickets.
Matt, absolutely fascinating talking to you. Unbelievably brilliant. One of the things I'd like to talk to you at some point is the whole Rhodes Scholarship Program and what that's created. I think that'd be interesting. Now, I'm gonna let
Oh,
people know
sure.
again. They can check out your Substack, check out your websites, check out your YouTube channel, and let us know what you would like Matt to dig into next in the comments below. This is Rich and Matt signing out. All the best. Bye bye.